Festival. The book festival is free, but donations are essential to the success of this festival. A $25 donation will get you a free canvas book bag, and donations can be made at the information tent. Food is available in front of the art shack here if you're interested in purchasing some food during the course of the day. Our author this morning is Julie Buntin, and her book is Marlena. And our introducer for her, an interviewer, will be Kitty Pilgrim, who is a novelist and a former CNN anchor and correspondent. Following the program, there'll be time for you to ask questions. And then following that, the author will be at the book signing tent, and you can go over there to have her sign a book if you already have one, and if not, we strongly encourage you to purchase the book. This is how we're supporting the authors who are kind enough to come today. At the end of the session, I will come up again, and I want to thank our author and our introducer. Thank you.
It is a great pleasure to be here, and it is an incredible pleasure for me to meet Julie, because as I was reading her book, I was transported. She is a beautiful writer. She is brilliant, and it's a subject and an area of the country that I don't know, and yet I feel that after I read her book, I actually know this area. I feel like I've been there, and I feel like I know the people in the book. And this is the sort of writing that you would hope to read every time you open a book, that you feel like you actually have new people in your life. And when you read her book, it is exactly like that. It's a tough subject, and I didn't know if I could take this subject when I first opened the book. And I thought, I might not be able to absorb this. It's about, drug abuse and poverty and hopelessness and, sexual issues that are difficult to read about. And it's a tough, tough subject. And yet she does it with such poignancy that you're drawn in, and you just feel so much for all the characters that you actually feel like they're part of your friends and your circle and your family. It's an amazing, amazing book. I can't say enough about it. One of the things, as I said, that drew me into this book, Julie, was the location. And I have never been there. I'm kind of an East Coast baby. And so I really had no concept of what life in Michigan was. And I want to just read one sentence. I hope you don't mind if I read from the book, because one sentence that really struck me when I read it. I just said, so Kewanee High School was a squat brick building in the middle of a cornfield. And with the snow swirling around it, I was reminded of one of those bunkers where scientists live for years in Antarctica, conducting tests of the Earth's magnetism. And I like the word magnetism because you feel like they're stuck and they're rooted and they are there. This is their environment. Tell us a little bit about setting. I know you know this area very, very well.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you so much for that amazing setup for the book. It was so kind and wonderful to hear your reaction to it. And thank you all for coming, and to the Martha's Vineyard Book Festival for having me, and the Treitmans for putting me up for the weekend. I've had a really lovely time here. But anyways, okay, to answer the question, I am from northern Michigan. For those of you who know the Michigan thing people do, up at the top of the state, about a 20-minute drive from the Mackinac Bridge, in an area that in some ways, I think it's a little surprising, having read the book and some of the issues it deals with, reminds me a little bit of here, coming here for the first time, in that there's a community of summer people, there's a community of locals. It's the kind of place that's about 5,500 people during the year, and then 14,000 people in the summer. It changes quite a lot, and it's got a lot of natural beauty and a lot of desolation in the landscape at the same time, because maybe I don't know how bad the winters are here, but in northern Michigan, they're pretty bad, and they last for a long time. And when I was growing up as a teenager there was this sense of the haves and have-nots, and I felt very much aligned with the people who didn't have as much. My mom was, like Kat's, the narrator's mom, my mom was a housekeeper for some of the wealthier houses on the lake, and I just had this sense that there was this world that was right there at my fingertips. It was completely unavailable to me. And I wanted to talk about that and write about that. And it's been interesting to me to see how people react in Northern Michigan, because like here, there's a lot of regional pride. Like when you live in a place that's truly beautiful. I mean, the beaches are amazing. The landscape is gorgeous. The fall colors incredible. I thought maybe people would be upset to see some of the depictions of drug abuse that I felt I did my best to represent to a certain degree authentically, with having had some experience watching women fall into down these paths, I guess. So if that sort of answers the question, I felt it was an area that hadn't been talked about, and there was such a tension in the landscape that was interesting to explore.
It's very hard to write about home because there's this reticence to offend. You have a little voice in your head that's all your friends and family that says, oh, I can't say anything too negative.
Yeah.
How do you get past that barrier?
Yeah, I was terrified to go. I was just in Michigan for the first time in a few years, in the middle of July to do some book events, and I was absolutely terrified to go home. I was like, people are going to be up in arms about this. They're not going to, because again, like Kitty said, the book has so much, so many difficult things in it. I thought people were really going to be upset, but actually people were just very excited for the most part to see their home in fiction at all. And it reminded me of like why we find stories so powerful, and why I hope that girls who are going through these things read the book and identify, or not identify, but feel empathy with the characters or see something in the story. Because if you don't see the world that you know represented in fiction, you feel, again, that it's like another area that's not available to you somehow. So I did this reading in this small town called Gaylord. It's about 3,400 people in the middle of the state. And there were like 50 people there, and all these teenage girls, and, you know, a lot of adult women as well. And like, they were like, we can't believe that Gaylord's mentioned in your book. Like, we can't believe it. And we know that Culver's, and it was really cool to see that that was what they saw. They didn't see necessarily, like, they didn't take it as a literal definition of the place, which I'm grateful for, because it's truly not. Like, and everyone's experience of home and of place is so different. Yeah.
That's right. These teenagers who are in the book. So let's get a little bit into character, because, you know, story is character and character is story and all that. One character's alive in your book. One character's dead. And what struck me was that each character, alive or dead, was equally vivid. Right? So I don't know how you take a dead person and make them that alive. It was really spectacular. I wanted to, I'll read another sentence just for the benefit of our audience. And your character, Kat, says, I suppose it's strange that I sometimes direct my inner voice to her or some younger version of myself. There's an argument we're always having. So this sort of live character and dead character have this tension still, and I felt it, and it must have been hard to conjure up. Do you have anything that suggested this to you?
Yeah, I love the way that you put that. I did. I mean, it was kind of a risky move as a novelist and someone who doesn't really know what they're doing. Like, this is my first book. I didn't exactly know what was going on.
What you're doing. She knows what she's doing.
But I decided to open with the thing. I mean, I open with Marlena, the title character. She's dead. You know, she dies by the end of the year. There's no surprise. There's no twist. It's not a murder mystery. It's not a thriller. It's really a story about grief. And for me, the oppressive thing about grief and what I wanted to explore, it's that sense that you're like on a train track and the train's barreling at you and you can't escape it. Like, that's what grief is. It's on you. You can't get out of it. So not letting the reader know that Marlena doesn't survive this year felt like it would be a kind of manipulation of the reader's trust that I didn't want to do. Because if the narrator knows and she's telling it retrospectively, and then she tells you at the end that this person you've come to know dies within the year, you're like, wait a minute, you knew that all along. Why are you withholding this from me just for suspense? So I knew that wasn't going to be the way that I created suspense in this novel. And the way that I wanted to create suspense or a sense of forward motion was through the question of how and why Marlena died, and whether or not Kat could have done anything differently to stop it or change what happened, which is not necessarily true. She was a teenage girl, but that question that you have, that sort of survivor's guilt feeling that I think is familiar to anybody who knows an addict, where you think, what could I have done, even though you know you couldn't have done anything. I hope that was something that created some of that tension, and then that guilt animates the character too. And I mean, and also that Kat sees Marlena as so defining to her identity, and this loss is so central to who she's become.
Right. The whole drug addict sort of dynamic. How did you research that? Because it's so authentic. And those of us who've had some experience in this world, it really is genuine. It is true the way you write this. And that is a hard thing to write with truth, right?
Yeah, I will, for fear of getting too heavy on an absolutely beautiful Sunday morning, I will say just quickly that my sister struggles with substance abuse issues, and I did lose a friend to this crisis, so to speak. I don't think of it as a crisis when I think about her personally, but when I was in my early 20s, it's a very different story, and Marlena is in no way our story or her story. But those feelings and that experience of just how you don't always know what's going on and how you feel so powerless, that was authentic to something that I hadn't known about, or just that feeling of being like gobsmacked when you realize someone's been lying to you all along, or that I did have some familiarity with. And then I also, for just sort of like context and larger picture stuff, I did read a lot about the opioid crisis in small town America. I mean, there's some great books. Dreamland is an amazing book about this that gives kind of a big picture look, as well as some writers who are writing great fiction on this subject, and regional writers from Michigan like Bonnie Jo Campbell. Yeah. So it was a lot of things, I guess.
It's interesting when the live character is dealing with the dead character who was an addict. So Marlena has this persona where sometimes she's being authentic, sometimes she's lying. And I liked what you wrote about lies, which is interesting. And it says, the lies you tell yourself to get out of trouble are sneaky. They evolve during the telling because their sole purpose is to keep the truth protected. And the insight of that just struck me. The whole sort of dealing with a person, loving a person, as these two girls basically did love each other. They hung out together. They spent.
I think they did.
They
yeah,
did.
I see it
And I mean, I'm telling you,
well,
to
it's
me,
like
they
people
did.
sometimes say there's so much conflict and the friendship is it can be so dangerous. But to me, it's about love. Like it really is a love story in a lot of ways.
It came through to me very much. And yet, how do you deal with I mean, they're such young girls that they were basically each other's partners for a while. How do you deal with a character who's authentic sometimes and who's lying sometimes? And I just could think of the organizational conundrums that you could get into trying to keep your character true and yet having almost like a split personality in one of these characters. Yeah,
well, that, like, you asked the question before about dealing with Marlena's, we know she's dead from the very beginning. And one of the things that motivated me in the writing of the book was this sense that Marlena was like always ahead of Kat, like running ahead, sort of like you just want her to turn around and you want to like see her face and hold her still and say like, who are you? And I don't think Kat ever can see that, and it's part of her frustration, and sort of I hope that's part of the momentum of the narrative, is this desire to see this person for who she is. And the kind of tragic thing we all realize, I think, as we become adults, which is that you can never really know another person fully. There's always something that's sort of hidden from you, and when you're a teenage girl and that closeness is what you want, I think that's especially heartbreaking for Kat. And then when Marlena dies so tragically, and she's sort of haunted by this, she's still asking herself, like, if I could have seen that thing, could I have stopped it? And, you know, that was part of it, I think, with Marlena. Like, I think actually Kat, and I was protected a little bit by the first person voice, right? Like, you're limited to your narrator's perspective. If it was third person, I would have to do a little bit different kind of work with Marlena on the page. But because she's filtered through Kat so completely, I got away with, I think, letting her be sort of an enigma in a way that the reader might have found more frustrating if she had been in close third, you know?
That's right. Well, it almost reads like a memoir, sort of, for Kat. Yeah, it's the one thing that struck me about Kat and her relationships to other people, because you're saying you're writing first person, so it's really spoke out her relationship to all different people. The sort of ne'er-do-well boyfriend who sort of is a drifter, and her mom, who sometimes she's sympathetic to her mom, sometimes she's not sympathetic to her mom. That's a hard thing. And also, it's hard to write about moms without your mom taking offense. I mean,
that's true. I learned that for the first time this year.
Was that really what you thought of me? I'm sure it was.
Oh my gosh. I was like, Mom, it's a novel. She's like, I don't care. It's terrible. It's okay now.
Yeah,
but
it's
it
okay.
wasn't for a while.
I'm awfully glad. But this sort of sympathetic, non-sympathetic is very much a 15-year-old head.
Yeah.
How did you climb back into that age? Because I don't
Yeah.
remember that age.
Yeah,
right?
that was really. I mean, it's so fun to write about teenagers, especially from. So I didn't want to write about teenagers from a teenager's perspective because then you're limited by like a teenage vocabulary and a teenage kind of view of the world. I wanted to write about teenagers from an adult perspective to have all that like psychic matter of Kat's life between 15 to her early 30s where she's looking back from, to kind of ricochet off of the perspectives in both time frames in the book. And it was fun to write about Kat as a teenager because teenagers are crazy. I love them. They're my favorite people in the world, but they are full of feeling and emotion, and they are wise and savvy and smart, but they're not wise. They're savvy and smart and can judge you in an instant, but they have no wisdom actually. They don't have the wisdom of like full experience. They don't often have like a fully developed sense of empathy. So they can just be like emotional messes that like stumble around on the page.
I would say you pretty much got that down.
That is so fun to write because everything feels so big, and I think one of the things Kat's asking herself is where that kind of that big feeling goes. Like, you know, it's a mess to be a teenager, and I wouldn't want to go back there. But it is. I do wonder, like, I miss the kind of intensity of emotion or the intensity of first times and that kind of thing. So it was cool to revisit that through Kat's eyes, and I think, you know, that's part of why adolescence is such a fun subject for writers because you get to see them experiencing these things that feel so big and vivid. You know,
we certainly capture the vividness of every experience, from
Thank
just
you.
looking up at the sky and the stars
Yeah.
to just feeling the cold. I mean, you bring us to that moment with that character that's just, I mean, it's absolute poetry. It's absolutely incredible. I think you're an amazing writer. I want to open it up for anyone to ask questions because now's your shot. Sir in the back. Could you stand up and
Interrelated questions. I have 3 interrelated questions. One, what happened to the semi-autobiographical work that you were working on at NYU?
How do you know about that? Did you read an interview?
It's in the Gazette.
Oh, it's in the Gazette.
Two,
Who did I tell?
two. Presumably, since you led a childhood very immersed in books, 25 a week, you led a somewhat lonely childhood, and I'm curious how that relates to the fact that you had a friend who died while you were a teenager. To me, there's some visceral relationship between being a loner who reads books, which I was too, and then having that experience of someone that you knew dying while you're a teenager when you're not really equipped to fully absorb that. And then, of course, I'm curious how that relates to what you wrote at NYU.
Those are interesting questions. I'll start with. Did I shut this off? Oh, okay. I'll start with the semi-autobiographical novel that I wrote at NYU will never see the light of day and is a terrible book. And I hope I would rather die than, no, it's bad. So that's over. But the question about, it's interesting. My friend who passed away when we were in our 20s. She was 21. I was also 21, actually. But we had been inseparable best friends in adolescence and had been kind of up to some of the same misbehavior, only her misbehavior intensified and mine just corrected itself. Like, I went to college and it was experimentation for me, and it was something very different for her. And I think, I did read a lot as a kid. I was a little bit quiet and kind of an observer. I think a lot of writers have that in their background. I guess I'll just say that I just felt her loss really intensely. I think anyone who loses someone suddenly and you kind of see it coming, and then especially when there's substance abuse involved, and then you can't believe it at the same time. I still can't believe it. I mean, it's been years and I still feel the same kind of intensity of that loss whenever I think of it. And I'm sure that will always be true. And I guess maybe those friendships were extra precious to me or something because I had been a little bit of a loner when I was a little kid. And then I found these really intense relationships with my female friends in high school. So maybe there's a connection there.
Sir?
I came in a little late, so forgive me if you touched on this early on. How do you, as a writer, write about themes
I think some of it has to do with the closeness of the eye on the experience. Like, I mentioned this a little bit before, but I think in most young adult novels, I really like to read young adult. But usually you're experiencing it with the character as it happens. You're not looking at it from an adult perspective. My book is written through an adult's eyes, so it doesn't have that kind of like immediacy. It's really about memory and nostalgia and some sort of like not bigger, that's not exactly the right word, but just different kinds of themes than like a plot-driven YA novel that's about the thing as it unfolds. I guess that's one way. And also I think it's just about language too. Like I really didn't want to write for teenagers. I really just like to write like sentences. I like to read them out loud. I like to think about how an image works. So I knew I wasn't writing. I mean, I hope teenagers respond to it. I think teenagers read with an intensity that adults sometimes don't have anymore. Like teenagers have intensity in a lot of their experiences. But yeah.
No, I have to say the use of language is just absolutely flawless, and it's written in a very sophisticated, mature way. So this was my trepidation when I first started to read this book. I thought maybe it would be too young for me. It wasn't too young for me at all. It brought me into really adult experiences, and yet gave me such an insight into another world. So I think the language, your love of language really comes through. Anyone else? Yes.
I have a follow-up question on this, on your sensibility in terms of language. When, as a young person, did you first experience the desire to find discrimination between words and the relationship and so on? Because it's such an essential part of your writing.
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. I don't know. I really was a big reader. Like, it's such a boring thing to say as a writer. Like, I wish there was like some more interesting twist to my story, but I just read everything. Like everything from like, I loved reading poetry to like Stephen King and like the pulpiest stuff I could find. Again, I grew up in a place that's a sort of a summer community, so we had some amazing used bookstores full of like cottage people's books. And that's where I found like Nabokov when I was probably 13 in a shelf that had everything he'd ever written somehow, and I just went through them like systematically. And I didn't at that time also wasn't in a great educational system, so I was sort of just like following my whims as a reader, and I think that somehow helped create a sensibility. But I really started writing poetry very seriously in like late high school and college, and thought I would maybe be a poet, whatever that is, whatever that means. I sometimes wish that I had, but I didn't know where to go with that. But I think that kind of obsession with like economy and precision of language and how things sound was defining for me in thinking about prose, I guess, or my style, whatever that means.
I would say you hit some pretty high poetic levels in this book. I mean, the language sometimes just really goes into sort of dream image state, with sort of a poetry state. And I think that your poetry background really shows in this prose.
I think if there are any fiction writers here, I think it's useful. It's useful to read poetry and to read your work out loud, I think, if you're trying to figure out how to do it.
Question? Sir?
I'm working on I started a book last fall. I can't say too much about it because it's like a bubble and I don't want to pop it, that's set at a boarding school and follows a cast of characters, a bigger cast, a close third, a little bit more of a broad canvas. I loved writing Kat's perspective. She's close to me in a lot of ways and thinks like me, but she's not me. And she's also going through something really tough. And I'm looking forward to not writing in that voice, in that intense first-person voice for my next book. I want to spread out a little.
That's the hardest question for a writer. What are you writing next? Because there's a certain point where if you talk about it too much, you lose your momentum. And in fact, last night I was talking to a very, very well-known author, and I said, "Are you writing something?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Good," and that was
That was the end.
Yeah, because you can, sort of lose it in the locker room. You can you can lose your momentum by talking about it too much. I wanted to ask. Oh, Tony, you can. Yeah.
When you said that maybe your educational experience was not of the best quality, possibly. Who were your role models then? Where did you get your interest? Who encouraged you? Who set you on
Yeah.
the path?
Yeah, that's a great question. I had a good I shouldn't knock the public school system in Northern Michigan. It's a good school. I moved a lot as a little kid. My family moved actually from Lower Michigan up to Northern Michigan, and I was between schools for like a couple years and bouncing around. So it just, when I was a little kid, I don't have like a strong memories of high school or of elementary school and middle school, like really at all. But my mom was a big reader when I was a kid, and we always had books in the house. There were a bunch of books that I wasn't allowed to read that were the most fascinating books of all, like Angela's Ashes. I wasn't allowed to read that when I was a kid, and every time my mom left the house, I'd go into her closet and get it and read like another chapter. And then she just gave up by the time, at some point, she was like, read whatever you want. I don't care. But yeah, my mom, I mean, she was always reading and always encouraging me to read. She took me to the library. She took me to those used bookstores that, you know, where you could get like armfuls of books for like 50 cents. Like she really, that was her, all her, definitely.
Not Angela Ashes, because of the intensity, because of the pain of that
I think
family?
there's a sex scene in the book my mom did not want me to read. It was always about like a sexual scene. She was like, I wasn't allowed to read her romance novels. I think I don't know how old I was when that came out. I was probably like 6th grade maybe. So yeah.
We have to wrap it up, but I do have one final question. We've been talking about female relationships, Marlena, Kat, her mother. The men in the book don't do well. I'm sure that it legitimately so. But I don't see you as a sort of man hater. Is there a strong male character in your future? I don't want to say in your next book because that's not good, but in your future, do you see yourself ever writing either from a male perspective, which could happen, or having a strong male character?
It's funny. I did not think of that at all. So many times people have been like, "Wow, the men in your book really suck. Like you must hate men." And I'm like, "Wait, what?" Like I don't think of that at. I think of Jimmy actually as a good male character, like a strong male character, and someone that Kat looks up to and has like a lot of faith. He's taken on like a father figure role in her life. But to be totally honest, I'm not that interested in writing male experience. I don't know. Maybe I don't feel like I can. I just don't really. I'm really interested in female relationships, and how females relate to like women relate to men, and I'm not. I don't know. I don't feel that yet, but maybe someday.
It just speaks to the fact that you write so close to your own heart that you are writing from really a very, very deep place in yourself. We have to close it down.
Thank you so much.
And I really regret this because I have 50 more questions, but I do want to say one thing. Julie will be signing. This is the book, just so everyone knows what it looks like, and I can't recommend it. More than recommended. It will transport you to an interesting world that you will not be able to forget for a long time. Thank you so much, Julie.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Thank you guys for coming.